When I first met Sophie, she was everything I thought I wanted. Charming, compassionate, and supportive. Or at least, that's how she presented herself. Looking back, I wonder if I was blinded by my own longing for love, for partnership, for someone to walk beside me through life's twists and turns. I didn't see it then, but Sophie was a master of illusion, weaving a web of kindness and admiration that pulled me in so completely. Our wedding day was the happiest day of my life, or so I believed at the time. Sophie looked radiant in her dress, her laughter ringing like music as she promised to love and cherish me. In those early days, I clung to the belief that I had found someone who saw past my humble beginnings, who loved me for who I was. But marriage, as I soon discovered, is the ultimate revealer of truths. The cracks in our union started small, a dismissive comment here, a condescending smile there. At first, I shrugged it off, convincing myself that I was being too sensitive. Sophie loves me, I tell myself. She didn't mean it that way. But the words grew sharper, the smiles colder. It was as though Sophie had been waiting for the ink on our marriage certificate to dry before unveiling the true depth of her disdain for me. She called me the son of a poor man, a barb she wielded with cruel precision whenever I dared to dream aloud about our future. Your big ideas don't mean much when you're starting with nothing, she'd sneer. The woman who once held my hand and encouraged my ambitions now seemed determined to crush them. My attempts to better our lives, to climb out of the modest circumstances I was born into, were met with scorn and mockery. I began to withdraw, retreating into myself as her words chipped away at my confidence. I told no one about the growing hostility in our home. After all, how could I admit that the woman I had chosen to spend my life with saw me as little more than a failure in disguise? There were nights I lay awake beside her, staring at the ceiling, wondering how we had ended up here. Did I miss the signs? Had I been so desperate to believe in her that I ignored the warning bells? But as much as her words hurt, what wounded me most was the realization that Sophie had never truly respected me. She had married me under false pretenses, pretending to be someone she was not, all while holding contempt for the man I was. The relationship wasn't just crumbling. It had become a battlefield. And the worst part? I felt like I was the only one fighting. Sophie had checked out long before I even realized there was a problem. She wasn't interested in resolving our differences or finding a way back to the love we once shared. No, she seemed to thrive on my misery, as though my struggle validated her sense of superiority. I began to feel like a stranger in my own home, the walls echoing with words I wished I could forget. I told myself it couldn't get any worse, that I just needed to endure, to focus on my goals and prove her wrong. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of the nightmare. The woman I thought I knew had yet another mask to reveal, a darker one, steeped in betrayal and deceit. And I, foolishly clinging to the fragments of our marriage, was about to find out just how little I meant to her. The signs were there long before I dared to acknowledge them. At first, it was just a feeling, an unshakable sense that something wasn't right. Sophie's laughter, once bright and spontaneous, now seemed forced and hollow when she was around me. Her phone became an extension of her hand, always clutched tightly, her screen tilted away whenever I was nearby. I told myself I was imagining things. Ethan, stop being paranoid. I'd whisper, desperate to believe it was just the stress of our crumbling marriage playing tricks on my mind. But the evidence grew too glaring to ignore. It started with the late-night calls. She would slip out of bed, her soft whispers carrying from the hallway. I convinced myself it was work. Sophie always claimed she had demanding clients. But who speaks to clients with such tender laughter, punctuated by phrases like, "I can't wait to see you again"? Then came the weekends. Sophie began dressing up more frequently, donning outfits she hadn't touched in years. She claimed it was for brunch with friends or business meetings. I wanted to believe her, but her excuses became less believable as time went on. One night, as she got ready for another one of her mysterious work trips, I couldn't stay silent any longer. "Where are you really going, Sophie?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she turned to me with an expression that bordered on pity. "Does it matter?" Her words hit like a slap. I wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, but I could feel the fight draining out of me. She was right. It didn't matter. Sophie had already checked out of our marriage, and now she didn't even care to hide it. 2 days later, I found confirmation. While cleaning the bedroom, I noticed her tablet on the nightstand. The screen lit up with a notification. I hadn't intended to invade her privacy, but the temptation was too great. What I found shattered whatever illusions I had left about the woman I married. Messages, pictures, and plans. Explicit details of her affair laid bare in front of me. Her lover, a wealthy man named Richard, was everything she believed I wasn't. He lavished her with expensive gifts, extravagant dinners, and promises of a life she clearly thought I could never provide. One message stood out among the rest. I'm leaving tomorrow morning. Can't wait to spend the week with you, my love. Ethan will never understand what it means to live a life of luxury. She hadn't even tried to delete it. The humiliation burned hotter than the betrayal. It wasn't just that she was cheating. It was the brazen way she flaunted it, as though I was too insignificant to notice or care. When she left for her so-called trip, she didn't bother hiding her joy. Standing in the doorway with her designer suitcase, she gave me a smirk that twisted my stomach. "Don't wait up, Ethan," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. And with that, she was gone. The silence in the house was deafening. I wandered from room to room, my mind racing between rage and despair. How had it come to this? Was I truly so blind to her cruelty, or had I simply refused to see it? I spent the night replaying every conversation, every insult, every moment I had tried to salvage a marriage that Sophie had already discarded. By morning, I realized something important. I wasn't just a victim in this story. Sophie had underestimated me. She thought I was weak, too naive to challenge her or fight back. But she was wrong. She believed she could humiliate me and walk away unscathed, leaving me to pick up the pieces of a life she had shattered. She had no idea who she was dealing with. And so, while Sophie reveled in her betrayal, I sat down and began to plan my next move. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Sitting there in the emptiness of the house, the weight of Sophie's betrayal sinking in, something inside me shifted. I wasn't going to lie down and let this happen to me. I wasn't going to be the man who simply took the punches and stayed silent, all because I was too afraid to confront the truth. Sophie had chosen her path, and now it was time for me to choose mine. It didn't take long for me to make up my mind. I wasn't going to play the victim anymore. I wasn't going to beg her to stay or try to fix something that was beyond saving. If Sophie thought she could simply waltz away with no consequences, she was gravely mistaken. I had spent years building a life, quietly working my way up from humble beginnings, putting everything into my career, my ambitions. I wasn't the man she had married anymore, someone who had accepted her cruel words and unchecked arrogance. No, I had grown stronger, more determined. Sophie's cruel dismissal of me had lit a fire I hadn't known existed, and now it was time to use that fire to reclaim my life. I would not let her destroy me. As I sat there in the dark, alone with my thoughts, I began to formulate a plan. This wouldn't just be about ending our marriage. It would be about taking back control. Sophie had done everything in her power to crush me, to make me feel small and insignificant. But now, I realized that all along, I had been the one with the power. She had underestimated me, and that was going to be her downfall. The first step was simple: gather evidence. She had left me with a treasure trove of material that would expose her for who she really was. I had her messages, photos, and even her flight details. There was no more hiding behind lies. She had made her bed, and now it was time to make her lie in it. But I wasn't just going to stop there. I wasn't some passive bystander in this drama, watching as Sophie walked away unscathed. No, I had to dig deeper. I needed to make sure that her betrayal wasn't just confined to me. It was time to make sure the people in her life, the ones who had been so quick to judge me, to look down on me, saw her for what she really was. I reached out to Richard's wife. She deserved to know the truth, too. She had every right to be as angry as I was. The man who had promised her a life of devotion had been unfaithful, just as Sophie had been. Together, we would make sure they both paid for what they had done. I didn't need to feel sorry for her. I wasn't interested in salvaging a marriage that had been broken from the start. I wasn't interested in fixing what Sophie had destroyed. I simply wanted justice, both for myself and for the woman who had been betrayed just as I had. The more I thought about it, the more the idea of revenge appealed to me. It wasn't just about getting back at Sophie. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my respect, and my life. Sophie had treated me like nothing more than a stepping stone, someone to be used and discarded at her convenience. She had made a fool of me for too long. I wasn't going to be her fool anymore. I spent the next few days working on my plan, meticulously going through every piece of evidence, organizing everything I had gathered, and making sure I was prepared for whatever came next. I made sure to document every detail, from her hotel reservations to the messages she had exchanged with Richard. This wasn't just about catching Sophie in the act. It was about making sure she understood the cost of her actions. And I wasn't going to stop at just revealing her affair. I wanted to expose her arrogance, her hypocrisy, her cruelty. I wanted her to see how little her money and her lover mattered when the people around her saw her for what she truly was, a selfish, manipulative woman who had no regard for anyone but herself. When Sophie came back, she would find that nothing in her life was the same. I wasn't just waiting around for her to come home and pick up the pieces. No, I was setting a trap. And when she walked into it, she would finally understand what it meant to underestimate me. It's funny how clarity hits you when you least expect it. Once I decided to fight back, it was like the fog lifted, and I could finally see things for what they were. Sophie's arrogance had been her undoing. She didn't bother covering her tracks because she thought I wasn't capable of doing anything about it. She believed her wealth, her connections, and her status made her untouchable. That's where she was wrong. The first step in my plan was simple: gather every shred of evidence I could find. And let me tell you, Sophie wasn't as clever as she thought. While she was off on her little trip, I went through everything: her emails, her messages, even her social media. She didn't even bother deleting the incriminating messages. Her text messages with Richard were a treasure trove of betrayal. It wasn't just the words, though they were bad enough, but the audacity of it all. She called me boring, mocked my dreams, and even complained about the way I dressed, all while telling Richard he was the man she truly deserved. But it didn't end there. Hotel reservations, receipts for dinners, and photos of them together. I had it all. She had left a digital trail so damning it was almost laughable. The more I uncovered, the more determined I became. This wasn't just about her affair. It was about everything she had taken from me: my dignity, my trust, my belief in the partnership I thought marriage was supposed to be. She had stripped me of those things, but now I was taking them back, one piece at a time. I took meticulous care in organizing the evidence. Every message, every receipt, every photo was categorized and stored securely. I even backed it up in multiple places because I knew Sophie would try to spin the narrative once I confronted her. And then I went further. I hired a private investigator to dig into Richard. If Sophie thought she had found her perfect man, I was determined to uncover every skeleton in his closet. I wanted to know exactly who he was and what he was hiding. It didn't take long to find out. Richard wasn't as spotless as Sophie seemed to think. He had a reputation for infidelity, a string of failed business ventures, and a marriage that was already on shaky ground. The irony wasn't lost on me. Sophie had traded me in for a man who was just as flawed, if not more so. With every piece of evidence I gathered, I felt a growing sense of control. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one being blindsided. I was the one holding the cards, and Sophie had no idea what was coming. But I wasn't just gathering evidence for my own sake. I had a bigger plan in mind. I reached out to Richard's wife, Emily, and shared what I had found. At first, she was hesitant, skeptical even. But once I showed her the evidence, her skepticism turned to anger. We spoke for hours, both of us venting about the betrayal we had endured. By the end of our conversation, we had formed an unlikely alliance. Together, we devised a plan to ensure that Sophie and Richard wouldn't just face personal consequences, but public ones as well. While I worked on the legal side of things, securing my assets, ensuring Sophie couldn't touch a dime of what I had worked for, I also prepared for her return. This wasn't going to be a confrontation. It was going to be an unveiling. Sophie would walk into the trap I had set, and there would be no escaping it. I took small, symbolic steps too. I packed up her belongings, boxing them up and labeling each one with the cold detachment of a man who was finally done being a doormat. Her jewelry, her designer clothes, her endless collection of shoes. All of it was neatly stacked and ready to be sent to her lover's address. As the days passed, I felt a strange sense of calm. The anger that had once consumed me was now replaced by determination. This wasn't just about getting even. It was about reclaiming my life. Sophie thought she had left me broken, but in reality, she had given me the clarity I needed to move forward. And so, I waited. Every detail was in place, every piece of evidence ready to be unleashed. Sophie had no idea what was coming. When she finally walked through that door, she wouldn't find the man she had left behind. She would find someone she had underestimated for far too long. The day Sophie was set to return, I felt no fear, no hesitation, just a sense of purpose. My trap was ready, meticulously planned down to the smallest detail. I spent the morning reviewing everything one last time. Every piece of evidence was neatly organized and accessible, and my alliances were firmly in place. Sophie thought she'd be walking back into her old life, but she was in for a rude awakening. The first step in my plan was making sure I was protected. I had spent weeks working with my lawyer to safeguard my assets and ensure Sophie wouldn't get a dime of what I had worked for. She'd used me, humiliated me, and flaunted her betrayal as if I were nothing. Now, the tables were turned. I froze our joint accounts, transferred my savings to a secure account, and made sure the house, my house, was legally untouchable. Next, I reached out to Emily, Richard's wife, to finalize our plan. We agreed it was time to hit them both where it hurt. I had shared the evidence of Sophie and Richard's affair with her, and she was ready to confront her husband. But we weren't stopping at a private showdown. No, we wanted everyone to know the truth. Sophie and Richard had paraded their betrayal so boldly, so publicly, it was only fitting that their downfall would be just as public. Emily and I drafted an email containing every shred of evidence, screenshots of their texts, photos of their secret rendezvous, receipts from their lavish trips, and sent it to their mutual friends, colleagues, and even family members. The email's subject line was simple but devastating: the truth about Sophie and Richard. With that done, I turned my focus back to Sophie. The house no longer felt like hers. It was mine, a reflection of the life I was reclaiming. I had packed up all her belongings and sent them to Richard's address, complete with a note that read, "You wanted her? Now she's all yours." I changed the locks, had her car repossessed. After all, I had been the one paying for it, and removed every trace of her from the home. When Sophie finally arrived, she wasn't greeted by the warm, familiar home she had left. Instead, she stood outside the locked door, suitcase in hand, confusion written all over her face. She tried her key, only to find it useless. I watched from the window for a moment, letting her confusion build before stepping outside. Her smug confidence wavered the moment she saw me. "Ethan, what's going on?" she demanded, trying to maintain her usual air of superiority. "What's going on?" I repeated, my voice calm, almost amused. "Well, Sophie, you no longer live here. Everything you left behind has been sent to your boyfriend's place. I figured it was only fair." Her jaw dropped. "You can't be serious. You have no right." I cut her off, holding up a folder filled with the evidence I had collected. "Oh, I have every right. You made your choices, Sophie, and now you're going to live with the consequences. Don't bother trying to play the victim. It won't work this time." She reached for the folder, but I pulled it back. "No, Sophie. You don't get to control the narrative anymore. Everyone knows what you've done. Your friends, your family, they've all seen the truth. And as for Richard, well, let's just say his wife isn't too thrilled either." Her face paled as she realized the full extent of what I'd done. "Ethan, please, we can talk about this," she stammered, desperation creeping into her voice. I shook my head. "There's nothing left to talk about. You made it clear that I wasn't enough for you. You belittled me, betrayed me, and flaunted your affair as if I wouldn't notice. But you underestimated me, Sophie. You thought I was weak, but now you see who really holds the power. She stood there, speechless, as I turned and walked back into the house, closing the door behind me. For the first time in years, I felt free. This was no longer Sophie's story, it was mine. And I wasn't done yet. The best was still to come. Sophie's face as I shut the door on her was a moment I'd remember for a long time. The shock, the disbelief, and, most importantly, the fear. It was all there. She hadn't expected this, not from me. And that was her mistake. She thought I was just a quiet, meek man she could control. That day, I proved her wrong. As I stood in the living room, I watched through the window as she called someone, probably Richard. Her voice was raised, her gestures frantic. She wasn't in control anymore, and she hated it. Good. Let her feel the chaos she brought into my life. About 20 minutes later, a sleek black car pulled up, and out stepped Richard himself. He looked every bit the smug, self-important man Sophie had described in her messages. His tailored suit and cocky strut might have impressed Sophie, but to me, he was just another entitled fool who thought he could take what didn't belong to him without consequence. He marched up to the door with Sophie trailing behind him, clearly ready for a confrontation. I was more than ready. When the doorbell rang, I took my time answering. They could wait. Finally, I opened the door, keeping my expression calm and neutral. "Richard," I said, as if greeting an old acquaintance. "What brings you here?" "You know why I'm here," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You've made some big moves, Ethan. I'd suggest you undo them before things get out of hand." I almost laughed at the audacity. Out of hand? I'd say things are finally in order. He stepped closer, trying to intimidate me, but I held my ground. "Look, man, Sophie's moving on. She's with me now. There's no need to make this messy." Messy? The irony of his words almost made me chuckle. I glanced at Sophie, who stood behind him, her arms crossed, avoiding eye contact. "You really think this is about her?" I asked, locking eyes with Richard. "This is about respect, something neither of you seem to understand." I stepped back and reached for the folder I had left on the table. "Since you're here, let me show you something." I handed it to him and watched as he flipped through the pages, his smug expression fading with every new piece of evidence he saw. This is illegal," he stammered, his confidence crumbling. "No, it's not," I replied calmly. "Everything here is completely legal. I have every right to collect evidence of what happens in my marriage. And as for your involvement, let's just say Emily was more than happy to share what she knew." At the mention of his wife, his face turned pale. "You told Emily?" "I didn't just tell her. I showed her everything. She knows exactly who you are, Richard. And she's taking steps of her own. So maybe you should focus on cleaning up your mess at home before trying to fix Sophie's." Sophie, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. "Ethan, this is ridiculous. You're acting like a child. We're adults. We can handle this maturely." I turned to her, my anger bubbling to the surface. "Maturely? You mean like how you mocked me, betrayed me, and flaunted your affair as if I wouldn't notice? That kind of maturity?" She opened her mouth to respond, but closed it just as quickly, realizing she had no defense. "This isn't your home anymore, Sophie," I continued. "You made your choice. You wanted Richard, and now you have him. But don't expect me to sit back and let you walk all over me. You've lost the right to be part of my life, my home, and my future." I stepped aside and motioned toward the driveway, where her belongings had been stacked neatly. "There's everything you brought into this marriage. Take it and go. Don't come back." Sophie looked at the pile, then back at me, her face a mix of anger and defeat. Richard put a hand on her arm, trying to pull her away, but she resisted. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice low and venomous. "No, Sophie," I replied, my voice steady. "For the first time in years, I don't regret a thing." I shut the door and locked it, leaving them standing outside. From the window, I watched as Sophie and Richard argued, their perfect facade crumbling right there in my driveway. It was poetic, really. They had built their relationship on lies and deceit, and now they were getting a taste of their own medicine. As their car finally pulled away, I felt an unfamiliar sense of peace. The weight of Sophie's betrayal had been lifted, and for the first time in a long time, I could breathe again. But I wasn't done yet. This was just the beginning. Sophie and Richard's world was about to unravel, and I was more than happy to give it one final push. By the time Sophie and Richard left my driveway that day, I knew the storm I had unleashed was only just beginning. Exposing them to their inner circle had been step one, but there was still work to be done. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about accountability. If Sophie and Richard wanted to play games, they had to be prepared for the consequences. The next step in my plan was to bring their affair into the public eye. Sophie had always been obsessed with appearances, priding herself on her spotless reputation. She had built her image as the perfect wife and the sophisticated woman everyone admired. I knew exactly how to shatter that illusion. It started with the email Emily and I sent to their mutual contacts. Within hours of hitting send, the ripple effects were undeniable. My phone buzzed with messages from Sophie's family, friends, and even her coworkers, all asking the same question. Is this real? I didn't respond to any of them. Let the evidence speak for itself. The real bombshell, however, came when the evidence made its way to Sophie's workplace. She had always flaunted her high-ranking position at her company, using it as another way to belittle me and my humble career. But Sophie's colleagues weren't as impressed with her as she thought. It turned out that while she was gallivanting with Richard, she had been neglecting key responsibilities, leaving others to clean up her mess. The affair was just the final straw. The company's HR department launched an internal investigation, and Sophie was swiftly placed on administrative leave. The humiliation of being escorted out of her office in front of her peers must have been unbearable. I wish I could say I felt sorry for her, but honestly, I didn't. Sophie had spent years tearing me down, and now she was finally getting a taste of what it felt like to lose everything she had worked for. Meanwhile, Richard wasn't faring much better. Emily had been relentless in her pursuit of justice, filing for divorce and ensuring their shared assets were frozen. His colleagues, many of whom had received the same damning evidence, quickly distanced themselves from him. The man who once strutted around with the arrogance of someone untouchable was now scrambling to salvage the fragments of his life. Sophie tried to fight back, of course. She sent me emails filled with venomous accusations, claiming I had ruined her life. She even tried to paint herself as the victim, blaming me for forcing her into an affair by being a failure. Each message was more desperate than the last, but I didn't respond. What was there to say? She had made her choices, and now she was dealing with the consequences. Her family reached out to me as well, begging for answers. Some of them defended her, insisting that I must have driven her to this, while others expressed shock and disappointment in her actions. It was strange, hearing from people who had once judged me for not being good enough for Sophie. Now, they were the ones apologizing, saying they had misjudged me. The irony wasn't lost on me. But the most satisfying moment came when Sophie's carefully curated social media presence began to unravel. Her posts, which once showcased a picture-perfect life, were now flooded with comments questioning her character. Friends and acquaintances, emboldened by the evidence, shared their own stories of Sophie's manipulative behavior. The facade she had worked so hard to maintain was crumbling before her eyes, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. As for Richard, his downfall was just as public. Word spread quickly in his professional circles, and soon, he was being blacklisted from opportunities he had once taken for granted. Emily's legal team was relentless, ensuring that his reputation was left in tatters. It was poetic justice, watching the two of them face the consequences of their arrogance and deceit. Through it all, I stayed quiet. I didn't gloat or seek validation from those who reached out to me. My actions weren't about revenge. They were about reclaiming my life and ensuring that Sophie and Richard couldn't continue their charade unchallenged. One night, as I sat in my living room, reflecting on everything that had happened, I felt an overwhelming sense of closure. The anger and bitterness that had consumed me for so long were finally beginning to fade. Sophie and Richard had tried to break me, but instead, they had only made me stronger. I wasn't the same man I had been at the start of this journey. I had faced betrayal, humiliation, and heartbreak. Yet here I was, still standing. And while Sophie and Richard scrambled to pick up the pieces of their ruined lives, I was already looking toward the future, a future that no longer included them. For the first time in years, I felt free. Free from Sophie's condescension, free from the pain of her betrayal, and free to rebuild my life on my terms. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but I was ready to face it, one step at a time. And I knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning of my new chapter. It wasn't long before Sophie made her next move, and frankly, I was waiting for it. People like her don't just accept defeat. They fight, clawing at whatever they can salvage, even when it's already gone. So, when I received notice of her intention to contest the divorce and demand alimony, I wasn't the least bit surprised. The irony was almost laughable. Here was a woman who had mocked my humble beginnings and flaunted her so-called independence, now trying to lay claim to the life I had built without her. Sophie's hypocrisy knew no bounds, and I was more than prepared to meet her in court. My lawyer and I spent hours going over every detail. The evidence I had collected was airtight, and the financial steps I'd taken to protect myself left Sophie with little room to maneuver. Still, I wasn't naive enough to underestimate her. Sophie had always been cunning, and I knew she would try to twist the narrative to her advantage. When the day of the court hearing arrived, Sophie entered the room with the same arrogance she'd always carried. She was dressed to impress, her head held high as though she hadn't just spent the last few weeks watching her world collapse around her. Her lawyer, a smug, sharp-suited man who seemed to share her disdain for me, walked in beside her, exuding confidence. And then there was me, calm, composed, and ready for whatever they had planned. The proceedings began, and as expected, Sophie played the victim. She painted a picture of herself as the wronged wife, claiming that my emotional neglect had driven her into the arms of another man. Her lawyer argued that she was entitled to alimony due to the financial disparity between us, conveniently ignoring the fact that she had willingly sabotaged our marriage. But this wasn't Sophie's courtroom. This was a place of facts and evidence, and I had plenty of both. When it was my turn to speak, I laid everything bare. I presented the messages, the photos, the receipts, every sordid detail of Sophie's affair with Richard. The judge's expression shifted from neutrality to thinly veiled disapproval as I recounted her actions. Sophie's lawyer tried to object, claiming the evidence was irrelevant, but the judge allowed it. Sophie's composure began to crack. She fidgeted in her seat, her confidence waning with every piece of evidence I presented. By the time I finished, the courtroom was silent, save for the sound of Sophie's shallow breathing. Then came the turning point. My lawyer, a quiet but relentless man, presented Sophie's financial records. It turned out that while she had been enjoying her trips with Richard, she had been siphoning money from our joint account to fund her lifestyle. The judge wasn't impressed. In the end, Sophie's demands were dismissed. The court ruled that she was entitled to nothing, not a dime of my income, not a share of my assets, not even the car I had repossessed. The evidence was simply too damning, and her attempts to shift blame fell flat. As I left the courtroom that day, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The legal battle was over, and Sophie had lost. But the most satisfying part wasn't the victory itself. It was knowing that I had stood my ground and refused to let her continue manipulating me. Sophie, on the other hand, looked defeated for the first time. The smugness was gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness. She tried to approach me outside the courthouse, her expression a mix of anger and desperation. "Ethan, wait," she began, but I didn't let her finish. "There's nothing left to say, Sophie," I replied, my voice steady. "You made your choices, and now you're living with them. Goodbye." And with that, I walked away, leaving her behind for good. The fallout from the trial rippled far beyond the courtroom. Sophie's family, once so quick to judge me, now turned their disappointment toward her. Richard's wife, Emily, pursued her own legal action, ensuring that he faced his share of consequences. Together, Sophie and Richard became pariahs in their social circles, their reputations ruined by their own actions. As for me, I began to rebuild. The experience had left scars, yes, but it had also given me a renewed sense of strength and clarity. I poured my energy into my career, focusing on the goals Sophie had once mocked. Slowly but surely, I started to see the fruits of my labor. I wasn't the same man Sophie had tried to break. I was stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to create a life worth living, a life that no one could take from me. And as I stood at the threshold of this new chapter, I realized something important. Sometimes, losing someone isn't the end of your story. Sometimes, it's just the beginning. When the dust finally settled, I found myself standing in a place I hadn't been in years. Peace. True, unshakable peace. Sophie was gone. The courtroom battles were over, and for the first time, I had the freedom to think about my future without the weight of her betrayal pressing down on me. It was strange at first, this quiet life. For so long, my mind had been consumed with thoughts of Sophie and the chaos she brought into my world. But now, as I sat in my newly reclaimed home, I realized just how much space she had taken up, not just in my house, but in my heart and mind. I wasn't going to let her take up any more. The first step was focusing on myself. Sophie had always mocked my ambitions, belittling my efforts to build a better future, but now her voice no longer mattered. I threw myself into my work, taking on projects I had once been too hesitant to pursue. Every success, every milestone, felt like a victory not just over the challenges of my career, but over the doubts Sophie had planted in me. With time, I began to rebuild other parts of my life as well. Old friends, some of whom I had lost touch with during my marriage, reached out to me after hearing about what had happened. Their support was humbling, a reminder that I wasn't alone, even when Sophie had made me feel isolated. But more than anything, I found joy in the little things. Cooking a meal in my own kitchen, without Sophie's criticism ringing in my ears. Reading a book without the tension of wondering what fight might erupt next. Even something as simple as walking through my neighborhood felt different, lighter, freer. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset, I realized how far I'd come. The man who had once been broken by betrayal was now stronger, more confident, and more self-assured. I didn't just survive Sophie's cruelty, I thrived in spite of it. Of course, life wasn't perfect. There were moments when the memories crept back in, uninvited. I'd think about the good times Sophie and I shared, the laughter and the love that once felt so real. And for a fleeting moment, I'd wonder if things could have been different. But then I'd remember the lies, the manipulation, and the betrayal. I'd remember how she tried to tear me down, how she flaunted her infidelity as if I didn't matter. And in those moments, the sadness would fade, replaced by gratitude, for the lessons, for the strength I found within myself, and for the freedom to start anew. I began to meet new people, slowly opening myself up to the possibility of love again. At first, it was daunting. Trusting someone after what Sophie had done wasn't easy. But I reminded myself that not everyone was like her. There were still good people out there, people who valued honesty, kindness, and respect. And while I wasn't in a rush to dive into a new relationship, I found solace in the connections I made. Conversations over coffee, laughter shared with friends, and even the simple kindness of a stranger. All of it reminded me that life could be beautiful, even after heartbreak. Through it all, I held on to one simple truth. My worth wasn't defined by Sophie, or by anyone else for that matter. It wasn't tied to my bank account, my job, or the approval of others. My worth was something I carried within me, something no one could take away. As the weeks turned into months, I started to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope for the future, for the life I was building, and for the person I was becoming. Sophie's betrayal had been a painful chapter in my story, but it wasn't the whole story. It was just one part of a journey that was still unfolding. And as I stood at the edge of this new beginning, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't looking back. The past was behind me, and the future was mine to create. For the first time in years, I was free, and that freedom was worth everything. Karma, as they say, always finds its way home. And for Sophie and Richard, it didn't just come knocking. It kicked the door down. Word of their scandal spread like wildfire. Friends, family, colleagues, everyone who once admired them now saw them for who they truly were. Sophie, who had built her life on her reputation, watched as it crumbled around her. Invitations to events dried up. Friends stopped answering her calls. Even her family, once staunchly on her side, began to distance themselves. The fallout with Richard was just as catastrophic. Whatever fleeting joy they'd found in their affair quickly turned sour. The financial struggles hit first. Richard, facing divorce and losing half his assets to Emily, could no longer support the lavish lifestyle Sophie had grown accustomed to. Gone were the extravagant trips, the expensive gifts, and the illusion of wealth he had used to lure her away. Sophie, who had always looked down on my humble beginnings, now found herself scraping by. She moved into a small apartment, far removed from the life of luxury she had dreamed of. The irony wasn't lost on me. She had traded a stable, honest life for a fantasy, only to watch it turn into a nightmare. But the real blow came when Richard decided he'd had enough. Their relationship, built on lies and deceit, couldn't withstand the pressure. Their arguments became public, their disdain for each other evident to anyone who crossed their path. Eventually, Richard ended things, leaving Sophie truly alone. I heard bits and pieces of this from mutual acquaintances. At first, I felt satisfaction. They were getting exactly what they deserved. But as time went on, my feelings shifted. I didn't feel pity for Sophie. She had made her choices, and those choices had led her here. But I no longer felt anger or bitterness either. I had moved past her, past the pain she caused, and I wasn't about to let her occupy any more space in my mind. Meanwhile, my life had taken a completely different turn. Free from Sophie's negativity, I had found success in ways I never imagined. My career flourished as I poured my energy into projects that excited me. The people I surrounded myself with were supportive and genuine, the kind of people who uplifted rather than tore down. One day, I bumped into an old friend at a cafe. We hadn't spoken in years, but she had heard about everything that had happened. As we caught up, she looked at me and said something that stuck with me. "You seem lighter, Ethan. Happier. Like you found yourself again." She was right. I had found myself. Not the man Sophie tried to mold or control, but the man I was meant to be. The man who knew his worth, who refused to settle for less than he deserved. As I walked out of the cafe that day, I felt a sense of closure. Sophie and Richard's story was no longer my concern. They had written their own endings, and I had written mine. Months later, I heard through the grapevine that Sophie had tried to reach out to me. She wanted to apologize, to make amends, as she put it. But I didn't return her calls. There was nothing she could say that would change the past or undo the damage she had done. And frankly, I didn't need her apology to move on. I had already done that on my own. In the end, Sophie and Richard were just lessons. Painful, yes, but necessary. They taught me the importance of self-respect, of standing up for myself, and of never settling for anything less than I deserved. They reminded me that true wealth isn't measured in possessions or status, but in integrity, resilience, and the people who truly care for you. As for me, I was thriving. My life was full of possibilities. Each day a new opportunity to build something meaningful. And while I didn't know what the future held, I was excited to find out. Because now, I understood something I hadn't before. Sometimes, losing what you thought you wanted is the best thing that can happen to you. It clears the way for everything you truly deserve. And for that, I would always be grateful.